I'm Edie Lush, and I'm here at the Innovate Finance Conference in London. Really delighted to be joined by Chandran Nair. Now, you're the founder and CEO of the Global Institute for Tomorrow, GIFT
That's right.
for short.
Yes.
Now, tell me, first of all, why you're here. What's your message here at a fintech conference in London?
Well, I was invited by the curator, and I think the invitation was based on her view that at a fintech conference there was perhaps a need to put things in perspective, and particularly to also get a view from a different part of the world, so that not everyone here is drinking Kool-Aid for 2 days.
Now tell me, you have an interesting view on consumption, on what sustainable development looks like. Tell me a little bit about how you got to that, what it is and how you got there.
Well, I spent 25 to 30 years on the environment, and that's been my life in sustainability. And about 15 years ago, I came to the conclusion, as I was consulting companies with things like CSR reports and sustainability reports, and realized that in the larger scheme of things, particularly living in Asia, that this was essentially scratching the surface. So intellectually, I reached a different place, understanding that in the Asia-Pacific context, the idea of sustainability needed a new narrative.
Mm-hmm.
So I decided to try and frame a new narrative,
Mm-hmm.
which would slightly debunk all that I'd learned before and all that had been established as the way forward. And if I could put it crudely, to suggest that there is a narrative about how the developing world needs to look at the sustainability challenge, which is not framed through the eyes, through the lens of the liberal Western narrative of the past 50 or 60 years.
And so tell me a little bit about that, because the argument that the next 50 years is going to be the moment when Asia Pacific comes into its own. But if we see the levels of growth that we've seen in the Western world at this point in the development, it could mean the end of the planet.
The world's population is going to be about 10 billion.
Mm-hmm.
Of those, about 6 billion are going to live in this part of the world. And I came to the conclusion, to all the work I've done, that the idea that 6 billion Asians can and should aspire to live like Europeans or Americans is hubristic and needs to be challenged. And at the heart of that discussion is, therefore, how do we develop in terms of economic models, political organization, and how do we define the path to prosperity?
So tell me, give me some examples about how you think it will be different, or it should be different in Asia Pacific, in Asia. When we were talking before, you mentioned no car ownership, for example.
So let me describe what it might look like if we went along the current trajectory.
Mm-hmm.
And that might give people an idea about why we need something different. So today, car ownership levels in the OECD countries are something like 750 cars per 1,000 people, depending on how you want to look at private car ownership. The largest car market in the world today is China. Car ownership levels are still less than 200. India, which will be the most populated country in the world by about, in the next 25 years, 1.5 billion people, car ownership levels today are less than 50. So Indians haven't even started driving.
Mm-hmm.
If the Chinese, Indians, Indonesians, the Vietnamese, the Philippines have car ownership levels taken for granted in the OECD, we'll have something like 3 billion cars in the world.
Right.
This is not possible.
Yeah.
Now, if you've been to the large Asian cities, you will know that we need cars like I need a hole in my head. But yet we are being told that the economic model to prime growth is the automotive industry.
Mm-hmm.
People have a right to individual freedom, to own a car, etc. Mm-hmm. The fundamental discussion is about industrialization through the automotive industry as a catalyst. Mm-hmm. We cannot go further. So if you've been to any of the large Asian cities, you'll know most of them are dumps.
Yeah.
I can say it, most people will not say it. we need a very different future. Now, therefore, somehow we will need to take cars off the streets. Try doing that in the USA. So you can't.
Yeah.
Why? Because the democratic systems of organization do not permit such bold draconian measures. We have no choice. We have to do it. And if we don't, we will create catastrophic outcomes. Now, I could go on about meat consumption, which might scare you.
Yeah, go on.
But
Tell me
shall I?
about that. Yeah.
So today, 350 million Americans consume about 10 billion birds. 3.5 to 4 billion Asians consume, in my book, that's a few years old, consume something like 16 to 20 billion birds.
Right.
10 times the population, only about double at the most. What happens when we get richer? We start to eat more meat. Most of that meat will be industrial meat, with huge ramifications for the externalities. Most of that meat will be consumed so that more Asians can eat cheap meat. Leaving aside the externalities of that consumption. If we all eat meat to the levels taken for granted in the West, do you know how many birds we'll be eating?
No.
120 billion birds.
Crikey.
Now, I don't know what that looks like, but sometimes I wake up with a sweat at night
Right.
and think of a bird god that will release all the birds,
Right.
and the skies will be darkened, the planes will fall off, and we all be covered with bird shit. Now, that is a reality. Unless we do something about this, the Asian path to aping a Western lifestyle of meat consumption and all of this will destroy the planet. There's just not enough to go around. So we're going to have to curb these things. And we have to curb this through, in my view, we don't have enough time, through essentially addressing two problems. One is the majority don't have the basic rights to live. Homes, water, sanitation. That in itself will essentially challenge the resource base, the basics. How do we do that without destroying the planet? We cannot rely on free markets and technology. And
you think the government has a bigger role to play?
I think the government, the institutions of the state, is the only mechanism by which you can do this. So that's the completely different narrative that I am essentially putting on the table. They don't have a bigger role, they have the role to play. And they cannot abdicate this role to companies. So I'm always horrified when I see international conferences on sustainability, and then you got, I will not name companies, but odd companies talking about sustainability and saving water. The intellectual dishonesty at the heart of that debate needs to be challenged, but it rarely is. And what I'm trying to do is say, that conversation is so old, we need a very different conversation. Now, we already have the most polluted cities in the world. We have the most degraded part of the world environmentally is in the Asia Pacific. We are going to add 1.5 to 2 billion people in the next 35 to 40 years. You don't need to be a rocket scientist to know that the current definitions of sustainability and their approaches are very, very superficial without strong intervention. And that's the intellectual discourse that I am trying to mainstream.
Chandran, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for stopping by my table here at the Innovate Finance Summit here in London. I'm Edie Lush.